She promised it was just a visit, but she never came back. I searched every street, every shadow, and when I finally saw her face again, it wasn't the reunion I had imagined. What I discovered in the newspaper changed everything. I still remember that morning as if it were etched into my very bones. The kettle had just finished boiling, letting out that sharp whistle I had grown used to over the years, and the kitchen smelled faintly of toasted bread. It was an ordinary day, or at least it seemed so at the time. I was sitting at the small wooden table by the window, sipping my tea, while the streets of Manchester stretched out in their usual quiet hum beyond the glass. It was autumn, the kind of day where the leaves scatter across the pavement and the air carries a crispness that makes you pull your cardigan tighter around your shoulders. She came down the stairs slowly, her suitcase in one hand, her other hand gripping the banister. I remember thinking how unusual it was that she brought the suitcase down herself. Normally, if it was just a short visit, she would take nothing more than a handbag. But that morning, there it was, a medium-sized suitcase, wheels scratching against the steps, announcing something larger than just a casual departure. "Dad, I'll only be gone a few days," she said. Her voice carried that same casual tone she had always used when reassuring me about the little things in life. Whether it was about paying bills, fixing a broken lamp, or visiting friends. I looked at her, searching her face for any sign that this was more than what she claimed. But she smiled that disarming smile, the one that reminded me of her mother when we were both young. "Where are you off to, then?" I asked, keeping my tone light, though inside me a small unease was beginning to stir. "Just to see a friend in London, nothing more," she replied quickly. Too quickly, perhaps, but I tried not to notice. The London trips were not unusual. She had gone many times before for work, for friends, for the occasional concert or gathering, but something in the way she avoided my eyes that morning made me shift in my chair. Still, I didn't press her. You learn, as you grow older, not to push too hard, especially with those you love. If you do, you risk pushing them away entirely. I offered to help carry the suitcase to the taxi waiting outside, but she shook her head firmly. "No, Dad, I've got it. You just sit and finish your tea." She kissed me lightly on the forehead before heading out the door. I can still feel that brief touch, warm and fleeting, like the last ray of sun slipping behind the horizon. From the window, I watched her place the suitcase in the boot of the taxi. She waved at me, casual and cheerful, as though she were simply popping down to the market for a loaf of bread. Then the car pulled away, merging into the morning traffic. That was it. That was the last time I saw her. At first, I didn't think much of it. She had told me it was just a visit, a quick trip. I busied myself with the usual routines, tending to the small garden out back, feeding the neighbor's cat while they were away, listening to the radio in the evenings. But as the hours passed, then the days, I found myself waiting for the familiar sound of her keys turning in the lock. That evening, I left the porch light on, just in case she came back late. The next morning, I made 2 cups of tea, out of habit. Hers grew cold on the table, untouched. I laughed at myself, shaking my head at the foolishness of it all, and poured it down the sink. "She'll be back tomorrow," I told myself. But tomorrow came and went. As the days turned into a week, my unease began to grow. I told myself not to worry after all. She was an adult, capable and independent. But there was something gnawing at me, something that whispered in the quiet hours of the night when the house felt too big and too empty. That smile she gave me before leaving, it hadn't reached her eyes. And the suitcase. Why did she take the suitcase? Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows made me turn my head, expecting her footsteps, her voice calling from the hallway. But the house remained silent, holding its breath as if it knew something I didn't. The strangest part is how ordinary it all seemed in the moment. There was no dramatic goodbye, no sign of conflict, no heated argument or tears, just a simple, "I'll be back in a few days." And I believed her, perhaps because I wanted to, perhaps because, at 78, I had grown weary of questioning everything. Trust becomes second nature when it's all you have left. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if she had been planning it for weeks, maybe even months. Did she rehearse those words just to visit in front of the mirror? Did she practice the smile she gave me, making sure it was convincing enough to hide the truth? I'll never know. All I know is that, from that day on, the house felt like a stage after the play had ended. The props remained, the photographs on the mantel, the half-read book on her nightstand. The scarf she always left draped over the chair, but the main character had walked off, leaving me behind in the quiet echo of her absence. People often say, you remember the last time of things only after it's gone. The last time you share a meal, the last time you hear a laugh, the last time you feel the warmth of a hand in yours. But in that moment, as I watched the taxi drive away, I didn't know it was the last time. And maybe that's what makes it hurt the most. I would have held her a little tighter. I would have told her not to worry about the suitcase, that I would carry it for her. I would have asked more questions, even if it risked annoying her. I would have done anything but simply sit at that kitchen table, sipping tea, pretending everything was fine. But I didn't. I trusted her words, simple and ordinary as they were. Just a visit. And that trust became the beginning of the longest silence of my life. When someone you love disappears from your life, your mind doesn't stay in the present. It drifts backward, as if rummaging through dusty cupboards, pulling out pieces of the past that you thought had been tucked away for safekeeping. That's what happened to me in the days after she left. I kept finding myself lost in memory smoke, so vivid I could almost smell the air of those times, hear the laughter, feel the weight of years that had gone by too quickly. I remember when she was just a little girl, no taller than my knee, running barefoot through the small garden at our old house in Leeds. The roses her mother loved were in bloom then, filling the air with a fragrance so sweet it could soften even the hardest of days. She had this way of collecting fallen petals, as if they were treasures. "Look, Dad," she would say, holding them out with her small hands, as though she'd gathered pieces of magic. I would laugh, scoop her up, and spin her around until her giggles filled the neighborhood. Those were simpler times, days of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and pancakes on Sunday mornings. I worked long hours at the factory back then, the clanging of machines ringing in my ears, even after I got home. But no matter how tired I was, her smile had a way of pushing all that weariness aside. I would sit at the edge of her bed, reading tales of castles and dragons, and she would hang on every word, her eyelids heavy but her imagination wide awake. As she grew older, her curiosity only deepened. I remember trips to the seaside in Brighton, the smell of salt water, the cries of gulls overhead, and her laughter as she tried, time and again, to build sandcastles strong enough to withstand the tide. She'd frown when the waves toppled them, then start again with determination in her little hands. That's who she was, a girl who wouldn't give up, no matter how many times the sea tried to wash her efforts away. Her teenage years brought new challenges, of course. She was restless, eager to stretch her wings, and Manchester felt too small for her dreams. She talked about London often, about the theaters, the music, the energy of the city that never seemed to sleep. I encouraged her, though deep down, part of me feared what the world outside our quiet life might do to her. Still, I knew I couldn't clip her wings. She was meant to fly. I remember the day she got her first acceptance letter to a college in London. She came running into the living room, waving the envelope like it was a golden ticket. Her eyes were wide with excitement, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Dad, I did it. I actually did it." I hugged her tightly, hiding the lump in my throat. I was proud, so proud, but I also knew that letter marked the beginning of her leaving. Not permanently, but in pieces. First for studies, then for work, then for a life that seemed to belong more to the city than to me. Her mother used to say she was like a star, always pulling toward the horizon, never content to sit still. And she was right. Even after her mother passed away, a wound that never quite healed for either of USU carried that restless spark. It was both her gift and her curse. There were happy visits, though. I remember her coming home during the holidays, her suitcase filled with gifts from London markets. She'd bring strange teas I could never quite enjoy, scarves too bright for my taste, and stories of friends I never met. She'd sit at the kitchen table, sipping her tea the way her mother used to, and talk about her life in the city. I would listen, nodding, laughing in the right places. Though sometimes I felt like I was listening to a world I no longer belonged to. Still, those were the moments I cherished. The house came alive when she was home. The kettle seemed to whistle louder, the walls seemed warmer, and even the old clock in the hallway ticked with more purpose. And when she left again, the silence returned. Heavier each time. One memory, in particular, keeps replaying in my mind. It was a rainy afternoon in York, years ago. We had taken a train together, just for the sake of it, no plans. No destination, just a day to wander. We ducked into a small cafe to escape the downpour, our coats dripping onto the floor. I ordered tea. She ordered hot chocolate with extra cream. We sat by the window, watching the rain blur the cobblestones outside, and for a moment, it felt like time had slowed down. She looked at me then, her hands wrapped around the mug, and said, "Dad, do you ever feel like life is passing too quickly?" I smiled at her, not knowing how to answer. Of course I felt it. Every wrinkle on my face, every ache in my bones reminded me of it. But hearing it from her, so young and full of promise, unsettled me. I told her, life always moves fast, love. The trick is holding on to the moments that matter. She nodded, staring into her drink, and I wondered what thoughts were racing through her mind. Now, sitting here in this quiet house, I cling to those words more than ever, the moments that matter. And she was all of them. Sometimes, I think back even further, to when her mother and I were young, raising her together in the heart of Leeds. We had so little than just a small flat, second-hand furniture, and dreams. Bigger than our wallets, but we had each other, the three of us. Nights spent around the dinner table, laughter spilling out into the corridor, the kind of warmth you can't buy with money. When her mother passed, it was just the two of us left to carry that warmth forward, and for a while, we did. Maybe that's why her leaving cuts so deep now. She wasn't just my daughter, she was my link to her mother, to the life we built, to the memories that still linger in every corner of this house. Losing her feels like losing all of it again, piece by piece. The past, for me, isn't just memory, it's survival. Each recollection is a stitch holding me together, keeping the fabric of my life from unraveling completely. Without them, I'd be nothing but an old man, sitting alone in a chair, waiting for a door to open that never does. And yet, even as the memories bring comfort, they also bring pain, because no matter how clear they are, they remain unreachable. I can replay the seaside, the rainy cafe, the laughter in our small garden 1,000 times, but none of it brings her back to me. The past is a cruel companion. It gives you the illusion of closeness while reminding you of how far you truly are. Still, I hold on. Because what else can I do? The only way I know to survive her absence is to live again in the memories of when she was here. There is a strange kind of silence that settles into a house once laughter has left it. It isn't the natural quiet of night or the peaceful hush of a Sunday morning when the streets outside are still asleep. No, this silence is heavier. It lingers in the corners, stretches through the hallways, and clings to the walls like dampness. That is the silence I have been living with since the day she walked out the door with her suitcase. At first, I didn't notice it. The routines carried me through the hours. I made breakfast as I always did. One slice of toast for me, one for her though. Hers went cold on the plate, untouched. I set out 2 cups of tea on the table, the steam curling upward like ghosts of conversations waiting to happen. And when I realized she wasn't coming down the stairs, wasn't going to sit across from me and complain about how strong I'd brewed the tea, I told myself, tomorrow, she'll be back tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went, and soon the house, once filled with little reminders of her presence, became something else entirely, a museum of absence. I would walk into the living room and see her scarf still draped across the arm of the chair, The one she always curled up in with a book, a pair of shoes by the door, waiting patiently to be worn. Her favorite mug, chipped on the rim, sitting by the sink. Each object felt like a message she had left behind, whispers of her life still clinging to the place. But as the days stretched into weeks, those objects began to change. They stopped feeling like reminders and started to feel like accusations. The scarf seemed to say, "Why haven't you moved me?" The shoes seemed to ask, "How long will you keep waiting?" And the mug, sitting untouched, became a monument to a person who was no longer here. I tried to fill the silence with noise. The radio became my companion, voices of strangers chattering about the news in London, the weather in Birmingham, the football scores from Leeds. Sometimes I would turn the volume up too high, just to drown out the echo of the emptiness around me. But the noise never truly filled the void. The moment I turned it off, the silence came rushing back, stronger than before. Nights were the worst. In the evenings, I used to hear her footsteps pacing upstairs, or the sound of her laughter on the phone with a friend. Now, when the clock struck 9, all I heard was the tick of its hands, dragging me through the hours like an anchor. I found myself talking aloud sometimes, as if pretending she was still here. I'd mutter things like, "I'll put the kettle on," or "Don't forget your umbrella." My own voice, bouncing off the walls, sounded foreign and hollow. The bedroom was the hardest place of all. I couldn't bring myself to open the door to hers for weeks. It felt like stepping into a sacred space, one I had no right to disturb. When I finally did, I found everything exactly as she'd left it, the bed unmade, a half-finished book on the nightstand, her perfume lingering faintly in the air. I stood there for a long time, gripping the doorframe, feeling as though I'd stumbled into a moment, frozen in time. I thought about cleaning, tidying up, putting things in order. But the thought of it terrified me. What if, by moving her belongings, I erased the last proof that she had ever been here? So I left everything untouched. Dust gathered, the bed, sheets lost their freshness, and the perfume faded. But still, I couldn't bring myself to change a thing. The garden, too, reflected her absence. She used to love sitting out there on summer mornings, a cup of tea in her hand, watching the sparrows flutter about the feeder. After she left, I noticed how quickly the weeds began to creep in, how the flowers wilted without care. I tried to tend to them, but my hands lacked the patience hers had. The garden became overgrown, a tangle of neglect, and I told myself it didn't matter. But every time I looked out the window, I felt as though the wildness was mocking me, reminding me of how little life remained in this house. The neighbors noticed, of course. They always do. Mrs. Clark from 2 doors down asked casually one afternoon, "Haven't seen your daughter about lately, Harold? She doing all right?" I forced a smile, gave some vague answer about her visiting friends in London, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes, the way her gaze lingered on the weeds in my garden, on the untouched curtains drawn in the upstairs window. People notice more than you think. Inside, though, the real battle was with time. Each day stretched on endlessly, and yet weeks seemed to slip by in the blink of an eye. That is the cruel paradox of loneliness. The hours crawl, but the days vanish. You find yourself looking back and wondering, what did I even do with all that time? I couldn't answer. Most of it was spent, waiting for the sound of keys in the door, waiting for a letter, a phone call, any sign at all that she hadn't vanished into thin air. But no sign came. There were moments when I caught myself preparing for her return, even without realizing it. I'd buy her favorite biscuits at the shop, thinking she want these when she gets back. I'd leave the porch light on, convinced she might come home late. Once, I even ironed her blouse, the one she wore often, as though she might walk in and ask for it. When I finally realized what I was doing, standing there in the kitchen, with an iron in my hand and tears in my eyes, I felt like a fool. The truth is, an empty house does something to you. It seeps into your bones, makes you question your own worth. It whispers lies she left because of you. She's not coming back because there's nothing here worth returning to. You try to fight those thoughts, but when the walls echo your footsteps back to you, it's hard not to believe them. Sometimes I sit in the hallway, staring at the door, remembering the last time it closed behind her. I can still hear the sound of it clicking shut, the faint rumble of the taxi pulling away. It replays in my mind like the final scene of a play, the curtain falling on a story unfinished. And the cruelest part, you never expect a house to become your enemy. But mine did. Each room turned into a reminder, each chair an accusation, each shadow a memory of what was lost. I once thought this house was my shelter, my comfort. Now, it feels like a cage. But I stay, because where else would I go? This is the place where she grew up, where her mother's laughter once filled the kitchen, where every wall has heard the story of our family. To leave would feel like betrayal. So I endured the silence, the weight of absence, the endless waiting. An empty house is not just bricks and mortar. It is a mirror, and what I see reflected back at me is a man who trusted too easily, who believed too deeply in a promise that turned to dust. And yet, despite it all, I still leave the porch light on. Just in case. There comes a point when silence becomes unbearable, when waiting is no longer enough. At first, I tried to convince myself that patience was the right path, that she would walk through that door one evening with some simple explanation, and all of this would seem like nothing more than a misunderstanding. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks blurred into months, I realized I couldn't just sit still. I needed answers. I started with the simplest attempt, calling her mobile. I still had her number written on a slip of paper that I kept in my wallet, though I had memorized it long ago. The first time I dialed, the line rang and rang, before finally going to voicemail. Her voice, cheerful, a little hurried, came through the receiver. "Hi, it's me. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you." Hearing it nearly undid me. For a moment, I thought I could almost believe she was still there, just on the other side of the phone. "Love, it's Dad," I said into the silence. "Just checking in. Call me back, will you?" I hung up and waited. The call never came. The next day, I tried again. And the next. Sometimes the phone went straight to voicemail. Other times it rang until the line cut off. I left messages, short ones at first, then longer, more desperate ones as the weeks went on. "I miss you. I need to know you're all right. Just a word, that's all." But her voice never came back to me. Only that recording, each time growing more haunting, as if mocking my hope. When the calls failed, I turned to letters. I wrote to the address in London, where she had once lived during her college years. The handwriting felt shaky on the paper, my words uncertain. I poured out my worry, begged for a reply, and closed my phone number twice, underlined. Weeks later, the letter returned to me, stamped with those cruel words, "Return to sender. Address unknown." I tried again, this time sending a letter to a friend of hers in Birmingham, a woman named Rachel I had met only once at a Christmas gathering. I still remember Rachel's bright laugh, the way she and my daughter shared inside jokes I couldn't follow. Surely Rachel would know something. I never received a reply. Frustrated, I even wrote to one of her old workplaces in London. I wasn't sure if she still worked there, but it was all I had. That, too, brought no answer. Each envelope I sent out felt like tossing a message in a bottle into the sea, hoping it would wash back to me with news. But the sea was silent. I started calling people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old acquaintances, distant relatives, even the cousin in Edinburgh who had barely exchanged a word with me since the funeral of my wife. "Have you heard from her?" I would ask, my voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. But always, the answer was the same. No, they hadn't heard from her in months, some in years. It was during one of these calls, late on a cold evening, that I realized just how desperate I had become. I found myself on the phone with a hotel clerk in London, stammering as I tried to describe her, hoping she might have checked in recently. The young man on the other end, polite but weary, told me there was nothing he could do. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen with my head in my hands, ashamed of how foolish I must have sounded. But the truth is, when you're left behind without answers, you will chase shadows. You will grasp at any thread, no matter how thin, if it means it might lead you to the person you've lost. I even considered going down to London myself. More than once, I packed a small bag, rehearsing in my mind how I would walk the streets, knock on doors, search cafes and libraries and parks. I pictured myself sitting in a busy train station, scanning the crowd for her face, but each time, I hesitated. What if I went all the way and still found nothing? Worse, what if I found her and she looked right through me, a stranger in her eyes? That thought kept me rooted in Manchester. The fear of confirmation was greater than the torment of uncertainty. Still, I needed something to cling to, so I began writing in a small notebook I kept by the bedside. Each day, I recorded my attempts, who I called, what letters I sent, what replies I didn't receive. The pages filled quickly, a log of failure, but somehow writing it down made it feel less like madness and more like persistence. At the back of the notebook, I kept a list of questions. Where is she? Why hasn't she called? Is she safe? Did she choose to leave? Or was she taken from me? The questions circled endlessly in my mind, but seeing them written in ink gave me the illusion of control. Neighbors began to notice my search. I could see it in their eyes when I stopped them in the street. Some offered sympathy, others thinly veiled pity. A few hinted, gently, that perhaps I should let it go, that she was grown, that she had her own life to live. Their words stung. They didn't understand. This wasn't about letting her live her life. This was about a silence too deep, too unnatural to accept. Something was wrong. I knew it. One afternoon, I even went to the police station in Manchester. I felt foolish walking through those doors. An old man clutching a photograph, asking if they could do something. The officer behind the desk was kind enough, but his eyes told me the truth before his words did. She's an adult, sir. Unless there's evidence of harm, there's not much we can do. I left the station more hollow than before, her photograph still clutched tightly in my hand. Every attempt, every call, every letter, all of it led to the same outcome. Nothing, no answers, no closure, no voice at the other end of the line. Just silence. But the silence itself became an answer, though not the one I wanted. It told me she had chosen this, or something had forced her into it. Either way, it was deliberate. And that realization cut deeper than anything else. At night, when the world outside was quiet and the shadows crept across the walls, I would sit in my chair and think back to the last time I saw her smile. I replayed her words. I'll only be gone a few days. I asked myself, over and over, whether I had missed something in her tone, something in her eyes that might have warned me. I blamed myself for not asking more questions, for not stopping her, for trusting too easily. And yet, beneath all the guilt and despair, a fragile hope remained. Because hope is the last thing to leave an old man. Each unanswered call, each returned letter, each dead end, it didn't destroy my hope. It only made it more desperate, more stubborn. I told myself, if she's out there, she will come back. She has to. She's my daughter. But as the notebook filled with failures, as the days dragged on, that hope began to feel like a cruel trick. I was seeking answers in a world that refused to give them. And the silence grew louder. When someone disappears from your daily life, it isn't just you who notices. A missing presence has a way of echoing beyond the walls of your home, slipping into the eyes and words of the people around you. And in a place like Manchester, where the neighbors know the rhythm of each other's lives almost as well as their own, absence never goes unnoticed. At first, the questions were casual, almost innocent. Mrs. Clark, from 2 doors down, caught me one morning while I was fumbling with the latch on the garden gate. "Haven't seen your daughter in a while, Harold," she said, her voice light, her tone more curious than concerned. "She keeping well?" I forced a smile, the kind you put on like a mask. "She's fine, Mrs. Clark. Just visiting friends in London." She nodded politely, but her eyes lingered a moment too long. People always think they're subtle, but you can feel when someone is measuring your words, weighing them against the silence they've noticed. A few days later, Mr. Thompson, the postman, mentioned it too. He had been delivering letters to this street for over 20 years, and he knew more about people's comings and goings than he ever let on. Your daughter usually picks up the mail herself, he said, handing me a small stack of envelopes. Haven't seen her lately. She all right? Again, I gave the same answer. London, friends, nothing unusual. I could hear how hollow my own voice sounded, but it was the only story I had to tell. As the weeks dragged on, the questions didn't stop. They multiplied. The whispers grew louder, even if they weren't always spoken directly to me. I'd catch fragments when I walked past the grocer's, or when I paused at the corner shop. To women, their arms full of shopping bags, muttering just loud enough for me to hear. Strange, isn't it? Just left like that. Do you think she'll be back? Another voice. Maybe she's moved on. You never know what goes on behind closed doors. It was that phrase, behind closed doors, that stung the most. People love to imagine the worst, and when there are no answers, the human mind fills the gaps with speculation. Some wondered if she'd run off with someone new, if perhaps she'd been unhappy under my roof. Others hinted at darker possibilities, their voices dropping to hushed tones as though speaking of tragedy might summon it closer. I began to dread leaving the house. The stares, the polite but pointed questions, the way conversations seemed to hush when I walked into the shop, it all became unbearable. Even the friendliest greetings carried an undercurrent of curiosity, an unspoken demand for answers I didn't have. The vicar at St. Paul's asked one Sunday, after service, whether everything was all right at home. "We haven't seen your daughter in church for a while," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I didn't know where she was, that I was drowning in silence, but pride held me back. Instead, I smiled weakly and muttered something about her being busy with work. He gave me a kind pat on the shoulder, but I could see the questions still hovering in his eyes. Loneliness is cruel enough on its own, but when it is magnified by the weight of others' curiosity, it becomes almost unbearable. I found myself withdrawing more and more, avoiding the shops where I might run into familiar faces, walking different routes to the post office just to keep from answering the same questions. My world, already shrunken by her absence, became even smaller. But the whispers weren't limited to neighbors and shopkeepers. Even relatives, distant cousins, old family friends began to reach out, not with comfort, but with speculation. A letter from my cousin Margaret in Edinburgh arrived one afternoon. Herald it read, "I don't want to intrude, but people are saying your daughter may have gone abroad. Is it true? People are saying." How quickly a private grief becomes public property. I crumpled the letter in my hand, furious that my daughter's absence had become fodder for gossip miles away. But anger quickly gave way to despair. If people were talking about her absence so freely, if rumors were traveling as far as Scotland, then it meant her silence was no longer just mine to endure. It was becoming a story others felt entitled to tell. One evening, as I was locking the front door, I overheard two young men walking down the street. They didn't know I was standing there, hidden in the shadows of the porch. "That old man's daughter just vanished. You know," one said, "never came back. Probably couldn't stand living with him anymore." They laughed, and the sound of it cut deeper than any knife. They didn't know me, didn't know her, didn't know the life we had built together in this very house. Yet they reduced it to a cruel joke, tossed carelessly into the night air. That was the night I stopped opening the curtains in the front room. I couldn't bear the thought of eyes peering in, measuring the emptiness of my home, speculating about the emptiness of my heart. And yet, despite the pain, part of me longed for the whispers, because whispers meant that she still existed in the minds of others, that her absence had weight, that she had not simply been erased. In a twisted way, the gossip kept her alive, even as it tore me apart. I tried, once, to correct the rumors. At the corner shop, Mrs. Davies asked me outright if my daughter had gone abroad. Something inside me snapped. "She's not abroad," I said sharply. "She said she was visiting a friend, and she never came back. I don't know where she is. I don't know anything at all." My voice cracked as I spoke, and the shop fell silent. Mrs. Davies looked at me with wide, startled eyes, and for a moment I thought she might apologize. Instead, she mumbled something about being late and hurried away. After that, The whispers grew quieter when I was near, but I could still feel them, just out of earshot. They wrapped around me like a fog, suffocating, inescapable. It is a terrible thing to live not only with loss, but with the constant reminder of it reflected in the eyes of others. The community that once felt like a safety net now felt like a web, each thread pulling me tighter into their scrutiny. I was no longer just Harold Bennett, the widower who tended his garden and kept to himself. I was the man whose daughter had vanished, and perhaps that is what hurt the most, not just the loss of her, but the loss of myself. Still, even as the whispers gnawed at me, I clung to a single thought. If people were talking about her, then she had not disappeared entirely. Somewhere, someone must know more. Somewhere, beyond the gossip and speculation, the truth was waiting to be found. But until that truth revealed itself, I was left with nothing but the whispers. And the whispers, like the silence of my home, grew louder with each passing day. There comes a time when silence no longer feels like absence, it feels like betrayal. A cruel, deliberate hand pressing harder on a wound that never heals. For weeks I had lived in the half-light of uncertainty, waiting for her footsteps, her laughter, her voice drifting through the hallway. But by the time I reached what I now call the breaking point, hope had thinned into something brittle, fragile enough to shatter with the slightest touch. It was a Tuesday in late September, one of those damp Manchester days when the air hangs, heavy with rain that never quite falls. I had woken early, as I always did, and gone through the motions of my routine. Tea in the chipped mug she once teased me about, toasted I barely tasted, the morning paper spread across the table, like company I did not want but needed. That morning, I lingered at the window far longer than usual. Each sound from the street, the squeak of a bicycle chain, the shuffle of a passerby's shoes, the slam of a car door made my heart jump. I thought, foolishly, that she might appear, suitcase in hand, smile sheepish, saying, "Sorry, Dad, I stayed away too long," but no one came. The street remained indifferent, life moving on without any regard for the cavern her absence had left in my world. I tried to busy myself with chores. The garden, once a source of pride, had grown wild in the weeks since she left. Roses that she loved so dearly sagged under the weight of neglect, weeds climbing over them like intruders. I bent down to pull a stubborn thistle from the soil, and suddenly, without warning, the weight of everything crashed over me. The thistle blurred, my hands trembled, and then, there in the damp earth, I broke. I wept, not the quiet tears I had shed into my pillow at night, but a guttural, choking flood that left me gasping for air. My knees pressed into the soil, my hands clawed at the ground, as though I could dig answers from it. For the first time, I admitted aloud what I had been too proud or too afraid to say. "She's not coming back, is she?" The words hung in the air, heavier than any stone. Saying them felt like betrayal, as though my voice had condemned her to permanent absence. And yet, once spoken, they could not be unsaid. I stayed there in the garden for what felt like hours, my clothes damp with earth, my body shaking with sobs I had spent too long suppressing. I thought of her as a child, running barefoot across this very patch of grass, her laughter like bells. I thought of her teenage years, when we argued about curfews and choices, but always made peace before the night was over. I thought of the last time I saw her, standing in the doorway, saying it was just a visit to a friend. That door had closed behind her, and with it, my world. Grief, when it finally swallows you whole, is not the sharp stab of loss. It is the slow suffocation of realizing life is happening without the person you love, and you are powerless to change it. After that day, I could not go on pretending. I stopped answering the neighbors' questions with polite lies. When Mrs. Clark asked again if my daughter was well, I told her flatly, "I don't know. She left, and she hasn't come back." Her eyes softened with pity, but pity was worse than curiosity. It made me feel small, broken, a man defined only by what he had lost. I also stopped keeping the curtains drawn. For weeks I had hidden, ashamed of my pain, afraid of the whispers. But something inside me shifted after that morning in the garden. If the world wanted to stare, Let it. My suffering was not a secret anymore. It was carved into my face, etched into every line of my hands. One night, I sat in the armchair, staring at the empty seat across from me. It was hers, the seat where she would curl up with a book, legs tucked beneath her, humming absent-mindedly. The sight of it undid me. I reached for the phone, desperate to call someone, anyone who might know where she was. But who could I call? I had no number for this supposed friend in London, no address, no way of tracing her path. She had slipped through my fingers like water, leaving me clutching only memories. And so I called no one. Instead, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, something I rarely did, and let it burn down my throat. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock. Every tick felt like mockery, a reminder of time wasted waiting. It was then, in that drunken haze of despair, that I realized the truth. I had built my days around her return, but she had not built hers around me. Whatever reason had taken her away, it was strong enough to keep her from coming back. That realization was the breaking point, not the tears in the garden, not the whispers in the community, but the quiet acknowledgement that I had been left behind. I wish I could say that this epiphany gave me strength, that I resolved then and there to rebuild my life, but it didn't. Instead, it hollowed me out even more. The following days blurred into one another, each one heavy with the weight of knowing she might never return. I stopped tending the garden altogether. The weeds grew tall, a living monument to my neglect. Meals became an afterthought. I ate because my body demanded it, not because I cared. Nights stretched long and sleepless, haunted by the echo of her voice in dreams that dissolved with the dawn. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the middle of her room. I had avoided it for weeks, keeping the door shut as though it might preserve her presence inside. But on that day, I opened it. The bed was neatly made, just as she had left it. Her scarf hung on the back of a chair, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the fabric. I sat on the bed and held that scarf to my face, breathing in what little was left of her, and for a moment I allowed myself to pretend she was still here, that she might walk through the door any second, smile at me, and say it had all been a misunderstanding. But the illusion crumbled quickly, leaving me clutching fabric and memories in a room that felt colder than any winter. The breaking point, I realized, was not a single moment. It was an accumulation, every unanswered question, every empty chair, every whisper in the community, every day that ended without her return. It was 1,000 small cuts that finally bled me dry. And yet, even at my lowest, one stubborn ember of hope refused to die, because no matter how much I told myself she was gone, I could not stop listening for her. Footsteps on the path outside. Even as despair consumed me, I still waited. It was a dreary Thursday morning when the world decided to tilt beneath my feet. The kind of morning when the rain had been drizzling since dawn, tapping its fingers against the window, a sound both comforting and cruel. I had woken stiff from another restless night, the same thoughts circling in my mind like vultures. Where is she? Why hasn't she come back? I shuffled to the kitchen, boiled the kettle, and prepared my tea in the same chipped mug I used every day. Routine had become the only thing tethering me to sanity. Tea toast, the morning paper, a fragile rhythm that kept me from sinking completely into the quicksand of despair. The paper was delivered late that day. I almost didn't bother picking it up, but something in me still craved distraction. So, I stepped outside, the damp Manchester air clinging to my skin, and bent down to grab the rolled-up newspaper from the doorstep. I shook off the rain droplets and carried it inside. I wasn't looking for anything. I never was. Most days I skimmed through headlines about politics, crime, or celebrity scandals, letting the words wash over me without sticking. But that day, God helped me, that day was different. I spread the paper open on the kitchen table, the smell of ink rising faintly in the air, and there, tucked into the corner of page 3, was a headline that froze the blood in my veins. Young woman from Manchester caught in shocking incident in London. My eyes locked onto the accompanying photograph, and for a moment, I thought my mind was playing cruel tricks on me. The face was slightly blurred, captured mid-movement, but there was no mistaking her. The curve of her cheek, the shape of her eyes. It was my daughter, Margaret. I remember gripping the edge of the table so tightly, my knuckles turned white. My tea sat untouched, steam curling into the air. Forgotten. I read the article once, twice, a dozen times, each word hammering against my chest. She had been found in London, not visiting a friend, as she had said. Not studying, not working, not building some secret future. She had been involved in something darker, something that made my heart pound with fear. The article was vague, as newspapers often are when they don't have the full story. It spoke of a raid in a rundown neighborhood, police swarming a block of flats connected to illegal dealings. My daughter's name appeared among a list of individuals of interest, though it did not say whether she had been charged. It mentioned troubled youths and dangerous company. But I didn't need the details. I didn't need the polished words. All I needed was the truth, staring at me from that grainy photograph. She wasn't missing. She wasn't dead. She was alive, but lost in a way I had never imagined. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold the paper. I pressed it flat against the table, as though pinning it down would somehow keep my world from spinning apart. 1,000 emotions warred inside me: relief, anger, fear, despair. Relief, because she was alive. I had dreaded for weeks that she might be lying in a ditch somewhere, her body nameless, her story unfinished. But no, she was there, in black and white, proof that she still walked this earth. Anger, because she had lied to me, because she had left with nothing but a promise of a visit, only to be found tangled in a world of crime and shadows. Because she had dragged my heart through weeks of torment without a single word of explanation. Fear, because I knew the streets of London could swallow a young woman whole. I had read enough stories, seen enough reports. Once you fall into certain circles, escape is not as simple as walking away. In despair, because in that moment, I realized she was further from me than ever before. Not just in miles, but in the choices she had made, the secrets she had kept. I pushed the paper away, but it might as well have been glued to my eyes. I stood, paced the kitchen, sat back down, then stood again. My heart raced like I had run a marathon, though all I had done was read a few cruel lines of text. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? Travel to London? Pretend I hadn't seen it? None of the options made sense, and yet I felt compelled to act. I couldn't sit idly by any longer. I reached for the phone, dialing the number of the local station. My voice shook as I explained who I was, who she was, what I had seen in the paper. The officer on the other end was polite, but dismissive. He told me the article was vague for a reason, that names listed as of interest didn't always mean involvement, that I shouldn't jump to conclusions. He thanked me for my concern and promised someone would look into it. But as I hung up, I knew I was being brushed aside. To them, she was just another name, another face in a sea of troubled youths. To me, she was my child. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the paper spread across my lap, the photograph staring back at me like an accusation. I traced her face with trembling fingers, whispering into the silence, "Why, Margaret, why didn't you tell me? Why did you have to face this alone?" Memories flooded me, uninvited. Her first day at school, clutching my hand so tightly, her nails dug into my skin. The teenage arguments about curfews, the slammed doors followed by tearful apologies, the laughter we shared in better times when the world seemed simpler. And now this, a headline in the paper, a face among the lost. The following morning, I made a decision. I could no longer sit in this house, waiting for scraps of news to find me. If she was in London, then so would I be. I would find her, no matter how long it took. The thought terrified me. London was a sprawling maze, dangerous in ways I barely understood. I was an old man, not a detective, not a fighter, but I was a father. And fathers don't give up now when their children are alive, not when there's still a chance, however small, to bring them home. I folded the paper carefully, slid it into my coat pocket, and packed a small bag. I didn't tell anyone, not the neighbors, not the few friends I still had. This was my journey to make, my cross to bear. As I locked the front door behind me, I glanced back at the house one last time. The garden was overgrown, the curtains half drawn, the rooms echoing with silence. It felt less like leaving home and more like leaving a shell behind. The train to London awaited. Somewhere in that vast city, my daughter was alive, lost, and in need of someone who had not given up on her, and I intended to be that someone. I still remember the chill of that morning as though it were stitched into my bones. Manchester had always carried a bite in the air, but that day the cold seemed heavier, more insistent, as if the city itself was reluctant to let me go. I pulled my old tweed coat tighter around me and clutched the folded newspaper in my pocket, the headline searing against my heart like a brand. The train station was already alive with movement when I arrived. Commuters rushed past with briefcases. Students carried backpacks far too large for their shoulders, and families tugged along, children still rubbing sleep from their eyes. To each of them, it was just another ordinary day. To me, it was the beginning of a pilgrimage. Buying the ticket to London felt strangely final, as if I were signing my name to a contract I couldn't back out of. The clerk behind the glass barely looked at me as I handed over the money. She slid the ticket back through the small gap with a kind of practiced indifference only railway workers seemed to master. I found my seat in the corner of the carriage, by the window. The train smelled faintly of coffee and wet wool, and the steady hum of conversation filled the space. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, watching as Manchester blurred into stretches of countryside. Rows of terraced houses gave way to green fields, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or distant church spire. As the train thundered south, my thoughts raced faster than the wheels on the track. What would I say when I found her? Would she even want to see me? What if she turned me away? Or worse, what if the headline had already sealed her fate, and she was beyond my reach? I tried to silence the spiral by focusing on memories, but even those felt jagged now. I remembered taking her to Blackpool when she was 7. She had eaten too much candy floss and ended up sick on the pier, laughing even as I scolded her. She had always been like that, restless, impulsive, unable to see danger until it was too late. The memory made me smile and ache all at once. Somewhere inside the troubled young woman in that newspaper photo was still the little girl who once clung to my hand on the roller coaster. I had to believe that. I had to believe she could still come back. The train pulled into London Euston around midday. The station hit me like a wave. Crowds, noise, the sharp scent of diesel and fried food. London didn't just move, it roared. People flowed around me like water, each one with a destination, a purpose. I stood in the middle of it all, my suitcase heavy in my hand, wondering if I looked as lost as I felt. I checked into a modest inn not far from King's Cross. The room was small, the wallpaper peeling at the edges, but it was enough. I unpacked only the essentials, a change of clothes, my shaving kit, the newspaper. I placed a folded page on the nightstand, as though it were sacred scripture, the photograph of my daughter peeking through the creases. That first evening, I walked the streets without direction, letting the city swallow me whole. London was vast, endless, its neighborhoods shifting like a kaleidoscope, gleaming towers in one corner, crumbling brick in the next. I didn't know where to begin. All I had was a vague mention in a newspaper article, and a face burned into my memory. I decided to start where the story had begun, the neighborhood mentioned in the article. It was a long ride on the underground, and by the time I emerged, the sun had dipped low, casting the streets in shadow. The area was everything the paper had suggested, and more narrow alleys, graffiti on every wall, windows boarded or broken. Groups of young men loitered on corners, their eyes sharp and unwelcoming. I kept my head down, clutching my coat, my heart pounding. I asked the shopkeeper, a weary-looking man with lines etched deep into his face, if he had heard of the raid. He nodded grimly. "Few days back," he said. "Police everywhere. Took some kids, let some go. Whole street was chaos." My throat tightened. "Do you know if a girl named Margaret Bennett was there?" He shrugged, already turning away. "Names, I don't know. Faces come and go. Best talk to the police. But I had already tried that. To them, she was just another name in a file. To me, she was flesh and blood. I spent the next days wandering, asking questions, following threads that frayed as quickly as I found them. Some people gave me pitying looks. Others dismissed me with a shake of the head. London was too big, too busy for one old man's desperate search. At night, I returned to my small room, exhausted but restless, staring at the newspaper until my eyes blurred. I prayed something I hadn't done in years. I prayed she would find me before I found her, that she would walk through that door and say she was sorry, say she was ready to come home. On the fourth day, I caught sight of a girl on the far side of the street. For a heartbeat, I was certain it was her. She had the same dark hair, the same way of holding her shoulders. I ran well, as much as my legs would allow, but when I reached her, she turned, and it wasn't Margaret at all. Just a stranger with tired eyes. I stood there, breathless, the disappointment heavier than any weight I had ever carried. That was when the realization hit me. This search might not end quickly. It might not end at all. London could swallow people whole, and I was just one man trying to fight against the tide. But even in that moment of despair, I knew one thing with certainty. I couldn't give up. I thought of all the stories I had read about fathers and daughters, about families broken and mended. The world was full of pain, yes, but it was also full of miracles. As long as I breathed, there was still a chance, however small, that Margaret and I could find our way back to each other. So I stayed. I kept walking those streets, kept asking questions, kept holding on to the image of her as a little girl with candy floss in her hand and laughter in her eyes, because that's what fathers do. They keep searching, even when the world tells them it's hopeless. They keep hoping, even when the headlines say otherwise. They keep loving, even when love feels like the heaviest burden of all. And as I lay in that small London room each night, the city alive just beyond the window, I whispered the same words into the dark. I'll find you, Margaret. No matter how long it takes, I'll finish.